short story writers ever, probably. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we see the picture of Anton Chekhovashian, short story writer, playwright, and physician, and is considered to be one of the greatest short story writers in the history of world literature. Anil, I'm reminded of a very famous short story that I taught at some level called The Misery, where there is this cab driver, this horse car driver, who lost his son. His son is no more, he is dead, and he has nobody to tell about his grief and his misery. So he tries to strike up a conversation with his passengers, all types of passengers, and nobody is really interested in listening to his grief and his misery. So at the end of the day, he's so much disturbed by the whole thing that he finally tells the story to the horse, the mare. So in some way, Chekhov's story about an individual who cannot share his grief with anyone, and in some way it's a story about a story.
Oh, sure.
This is how story emerges, right? When individual has nobody to share, and it's the loss of this community and social bonding that is connected to the rise of modern novel that Frank O'Connor talks about when we look at him in detail. So
Again, the example that you give reminds me that it's the urge to narrate, or it's the urge to say that makes a writer, let's say, write a short story.
Right.
Because he has a story that wants to come out. And that becomes very important, whereas a short story is concerned. Whereas in a novel, it's a more methodological sort of a thing, where a writer should have more patience and should, let's say, make it more artistic, let's say, when he's following the form, when he's writing about it. And a novel takes, let's say, many a times a year, 2 years, 3 years. Whereas a short story, let's say, it flows out. Because there is something inside the inner urge of the
there is
writer.
some element of spontaneity,
And,
inner urge,
as we may find in various subjective poems as well.
right, exactly. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we have, as we said, Edgar Allan Poe, one of the earliest important theorists of short story as a form. And when Edgar Allan Poe read Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and both of them are very important American writers, and he made the first real analysis of the difference between short story and the novel. And he defines short story quite simply as a narrative, as you mentioned, Anil, that can be read at one sitting. William Boyd takes Poe's definition further by saying a true, fully functioning short story should achieve a totality of effect that makes it almost impossible to encapsulate or summarize. So the effect which short story conveys is very different from the effect that a novel conveys, and it's this effect which is of very importance to us as students of literature, because it's these two effects that we have to pay attention to, and this Edgar Allan Poe's almost classic definition of short story.
Oh yes, and Edgar Allan Poe becomes very important because he was the pioneer, so among the pioneers who started theorizing story, who started thinking as to what a story is as a literary form. And many a times students are told that Edgar Allan Poe is the father of modern story, which is not entirely true. But at the same time, he was amongst the pioneers who started thinking about the short story as a literary form and started defining it, distinguishing it from other forms. Here again, a very important thing, as Boyd says, as you say, that it is encapsulate or cannot be encapsulated or cannot be summarized. That again tells us that it is so compressed an art that you cannot summarize it in a line or two, or you cannot summarize it in a, let's say, few lines as you can do with the novel.
Yeah. So short story is very difficult to paraphrase because the effect that it conveys is not really about the plot, but it seems to be the overall impression, the totality which Boyd so rightly points out. So, and Edgar Allan Poe, as we all know, is also one of the earliest of horror and detective form, very popular formats in fiction.
And at the same time, he even vouched for art's sake. And he said that a story should be about story. If I remember one of his stories, The Fall of the House of Usher, a very important story that again tells us more about the narration, how the narration moves forward. And it's a story that tells us about, let's say, a brother and sister who live alone in a very big mansion. And the writer who is invited there to be with them, he spends a night with them. He is there and he sees the horror that they are going through. This mansion is in a place which is very far away removed from the society. And as this story moves forward, you come to know that the entire mansion also falls. Here again, most important thing is that Edgar Allan Poe is writing this story about writing a story and not about a society that he depicts in it. Whereas in a novel, you generally talk about the society that is around you. So in a way, you could say that Edgar Allan Poe even initiated the metafiction that we see today.
So let's go further. And we have this picture of Edgar Allan Poe here, who was an American author, poet, and critic. Considered as part of American Romantic movement, Poe was one of the earliest practitioners and theorists of short story. And later on, this tradition of American theorizing of fiction was again taken further by Henry James. And his Art of Fiction is one of the most earliest and most important statements on the subject. So let's look at this distinction between short story and the novel, and what Boyd has to say about it.
Boyd says that the effect of reading a good short story is quite different from the effect of reading a good novel. The great modern short stories possess a quality of mystery and beguiling resonance about them, a complexity of afterthought that cannot be pinned down or analyzed.
Yeah, so what Boyd seems to be saying, Anil, is that the impression or the effect or the impact which the short story leaves on the reader is very difficult to capture in words or state what exactly it is. There is this quality of mystery and resonance about it, and there is a complexity, and all this is owing to the compression and concentration of a literary form as against elaboration and extension of narrative in the novel. So we have two different impacts that they create upon us.
Again, Henry James once said that a short story writer is like a man who has 2 pennies or 2 coins, and if he can, let's say, do without spending the second, he wouldn't do it.
Exactly.
So he'll be as economical as he has to be, both with words and with thought.
Right. Now let's look at a very important theorist of short story, again an Irish writer who has almost 150 works, and his name is Frank O'Connor, and he is known for his short stories and memoirs. His most famous work is The Lonely Voice in 1963, and this is one of very important statements on short story as a literary form, and as the title suggests, it's the lonely voice. So the voice of a loner is what short story is all about. So that's what makes it very important form. What he has to say, let's have a look. There is in the short story, says Frank O'Connor, at its most characteristic purpose, something that we do not find in the novel, an intense awareness of human loneliness. The story, Connor points out, deals with the submerged population groups consisting of outlawed figures wandering about the fringes of society. So I'm reminded again of Anton Chekhov's horse cart driver, who is actually an isolated, marginalized figure, and his loneliness there is no one to share. So short story is about individuals who are on the margins of the society, who really don't have a voice in the matter, and these are the people whose lonely voice story tries to capture. And this is a very important way of looking at short story. So you can compare short story with the rise of individualism in the West.
Oh yes, and it is one of the, let's say, greatest subjective forms we find in prose.
Right.
Whereas in verse you have various forms which are very subjective, closer to the heart and emotion. Whereas in, let's say, the prosaic form or in prose, you find the short story that talks about the subjectivity, the feeling, or the inner urge to express oneself. When he says that he is a loner, again, not exactly as a loner in the society, but a loner who thinks that his views cannot be told to the others, just as you, let's say, mentioned the horse cart driver,
Right.
who thinks that there is nobody to listen to my story, and so I should pen it down, so that I should write it down. And writing that story down relieves him of, let's say, that inner urge.
Right.
You could even compare him with the let's say Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner.
Right.
Whereas the Ancient Mariner has this inner urge to narrate his story, and there's no one to, let's say, hear that story.
Exactly.
Once you find someone to listen to that story, you are, let's say, out of that imprisonment.
Exactly.
Out of yourself. So that inner urge is very important, and a short story writer very subjectively, let's say, describes that inner urge with using the compressed form in prose. That is the short story.
So what is interesting, Anil, here is that earlier oral traditions and oral narratives, they had somebody who could listen to the stories. There were listeners, there was an audience. So there were people in this face-to-face kind of social setup. Amne samne, whereas a person can tell a story and somebody was there to listen to him. So what happened with the rise of industrialism and modernity is the collapse of these face-to-face communities. And short story is about, in some way, collapse of this face-to-face community, and so it's very different, according to O'Connor, from the oral narrative forms.
Oh yes, and as you said, there are sociological reasons that are more important for the development of the short story.
Right.
Because just as a writer wants to communicate, even the reader wants to imbibe and communicate his feelings.
Right.
And he may not find in that disintegrating society during industrialization, he may not find people who will give him, let's say, lend him, let's say, a patient ear to listen. And that is why he finds in that short story his own expressions or his or her own views expressed. And that is why the short story became, again, a very important, let's say, form of literature that developed very fast, because short story could be read in a short span of time. Every week in those journals or in those newspapers, every day you could find different short stories, and you could find people who could relate to them in a very short span of time. Whereas if you're reading a novel, you need to devote more time to reading a novel and to understanding that novel.
Right.
Whereas a short story does not require understanding to that extent, because it is, let's say, the imbibing of the short story, the total effect of the short story, which becomes more important. And so the short story affects directly to the subjective reader and both to the subjective, let's say, writer.
Right, and I think a very interesting example can be found in Indian context, where you can actually see how Frank O'Connor's argument stands valid. Is the story of Kabuliwala by Rabindranath Tagore, where Kabuliwala is a dry fruit seller, a marginal fringe figure on the society, and his relation with the girl of a very respectable family, a small girl whom he gives dry fruits every time he meets, and then one fine day he is actually thrown out.
Yep.
And his loneliness and his agony and his inability to relate to that grown-up girl at the time of her marriage is something what Frank O'Connor means by the lonely voice.
Oh yes, sure.
Let's have
a very good example.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. One of the most important aspects of the short story as a genre, according to Frank O'Connor, is its focus on the individual and his or her loneliness and social marginality, is what we talked about Kabuliwala and the horse cart driver. O'Connor also notes the modern short story begins and continues to function as a private art, intended to satisfy the standards of the individual, solitary and critical reader. The novel, on the other hand, emphasizes the process of identification between the reader and the character, according to Frank O'Connor.
Very good definition.
Let's now look at the novel as a form, and let us compare a novel with the short story again. The novel, in Gujarati we call it Naval Katha, is an extended prose fictional narrative of around 50,000 words or more, which arose in the late 17th and early 18th century and overtook verse narratives. Narratives are the stories told in a poetic verse format in popularity and eventually replaced them. Its roots go back to medieval and early modern romance and the tradition of the novella. The latter supplied the present generic term in the late 18th century. So word novel comes from novella in Italian. And here, Anil, you can see that very interestingly, prose narrative, prose fiction replaced the verse narrative, which was oral. And thus, it emerged as a new form, and the older forms became more marginal. So you can see how, as society changes, literary forms are also transform.
Oh yes, they have to adapt to the changes,
Yeah.
and novel is one of the forms which has very, let's say, nicely adapted to the changing forms, and that
Right.
is why today you have more number of novels written as compared to, let's say, the drama or poems or other genres that we talked about earlier.
Right. So let's look at this more closely. Let's look at the term romance that we mentioned in the earlier slide. And word romance is liable to create a misunderstanding among students who associate it only with love affair or something like that. But the romance is a technical term to describe a medieval narrative genre, and it is precursor of the novel. Written at first in verse, as in the works of Chatillon de Troyes, and later in prose, Malory's La Morte d'Arthur. The romances were popular in the aristocratic, rich upper class circle of high medieval and early Europe. They were fantastic stories about marvel-filled adventures, often of a knight errant portrayed as having heroic quality who goes on a quest. So they were also called chivalric romances. Chivalry implies a certain institution in medieval Madhyakal Europe where you find the stories of knights or the sardars, the knights, and adventures of those knights against various demons and enemies and so on. So romances often dealt with stories of knights and very improbable and romantic and fantastic stories that romances told. So novel replaced this form of romance. So let's have a look how it did. The term novel in most of the European languages is roman, which suggests closeness to medieval roman. So in many European languages, novel is called roman. The English name, however, is derived from Italian novella, meaning a little new thing. Romances and novels, short stories, short tales in prose were predecessors of the novel, as were the picaresque narrative. So Anil, let's look at this picaresque narrative which emerged out of the collapse of romance, how romance became less and less popular and picaresque replaced that. So let's have a look at what is meant by picaresque.
Just a moment before that, if I could say, Sajan, if we could take it back, let's say to even before the medieval times, in the ancient times, you have mythological characters,
Right.
who, let's say, perform all these adventures, who, let's say, move on these adventurous errands. Later on in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, in the Middle Ages, you find them replaced by the knights
Right.
and their errantries. But then they were expressed in, let's say, poetry.
Right.
Whereas in, let's say, 18th century onwards, when the novel replaces it, and even the, let's say, picaresque novel or the picar replaces it, you find that human beings or human characters replace those mythological gods, which were replaced by, let's say, the knights, were replaced by these rogues.
Right.
Again, these rogues